It will be available. Let me just start that. Okay, it will be available through the platform. All right, so with that, Jenna, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Let me share my screen. Is that working for everybody to see just the slides? Yep, all right. Excellent. So as Debbie mentioned, I'm with MIT Sloan. I'm a PhD candidate in the Work and Organization Studies group there. Rising sixth year at this point. So this work that I'll be sharing today is part of my dissertation. The paper is still very much in progress. So I'm looking forward to comments and questions and kind of thoughts that can help move it forward. And I'm actually still in the midst of data collection for what will be a second paper coming out of this kind of related topic, which I can talk more about if we have time. So this is an ethnography that I conducted in a machine tool shop regarding its implementation and use of a smart manufacturing technology. Some of you might be familiar with this term. Industry 4.0 or Industrial Internet of Things are kind of similar terms, and that's what I mean to evoke here. So this is largely the use of sensors to create cyber-physical systems throughout the production process, to collect and visualize real-time data from many machines at once. And smart manufacturing is still in its early stages, particularly in small to medium-sized manufacturers like the one I studied. So as such, we don't know much about how frontline workers can provide input into these technologies and whether workers' voice will look similar or different compared to prior generations of technologies. So what might be different from some of the other speakers here is that I'm bounding this study to specifically discuss worker voice around technologies rather than around issues like wages and working conditions. And I'm talking more about informal mechanisms for voice than more formal mechanisms like unions, because the firm that I studied is not unionized. So I developed the two research questions that you see here. How can workers provide input into the way smart manufacturing technologies are used in the workplace? And what consequences does such worker voice present for workers, managers, and technology vendors? And because we have such a short time today, I'm going to lead with the punchline here. So first, smart manufacturing technologies provide new opportunities and challenges for worker voice as compared to old technologies, and I'll cover these on the next slide. Second, over 2 time periods of data collection with one firm, I identified 2 models of worker voice, and one of which was pretty different from what I identified in the literature. So in prior research, worker voice regarding workplace technologies is generally understood as operating through negotiated agreements between workers and managers, generally leveraged during technology implementation, and is usually situated towards customizing technology and work routines to each other in a specific workplace. I did see that within my site, but I also saw a second form of voice, which operated through a direct channel between workers and technology vendors that elevated worker feedback to be on par with that of management. It was deployed throughout the life cycle of technology use, and it was leveraged to brainstorm new technology capabilities that were quickly and broadly applied across the set of firms using the technology. And third here, I identified the changes made by the third-party technology vendor, including the frequency and nature of the changes made to the technology itself and the mode of the vendor's involvement with the firm, occasioned this shift from one form of worker voice to another. I'll go through what I mean by each of these. So prior literature on worker voice and employee involvement generally focuses on the organization of work and the managerial practices put in place to promote employee involvement. So I'm referring here to earlier work on lean and high performance work systems, and also to work on information and communication technologies that show firms using employee involvement practices can receive outsized gains from technologies compared to firms that don't use these practices. But this literature has sort of backgrounded the artifacts themselves. So in this paper, I'm considering what's new about these technologies and how these material differences might matter for worker voice. And specifically, I'm kind of diving in on these 3 features of smart manufacturing technologies. The first is that they're managed by these third-party vendors that can have long-term relationships with the manufacturing firms that are using the technologies. And insofar as vendors resemble modern tech companies and have norms around user-centered design, they might be interested in expanding worker voice and hearing from frontline workers. Yet vendors have their own interests that might undermine worker voice because they're interested in developing innovative features, and that may be their priority. Second, these technologies are incredibly flexible. Their features and functions can be continually changed, and this might allow workers to make actionable suggestions throughout the duration of technology use. But workers might be unaccustomed to suggesting these type of changes and might not be given venues to suggest these type of changes. Third, these technologies are networked across firms, often sold under a platform model as a service. So this means that any individual user's suggestion can be developed and pushed out to the set of firms using the technology. But vendors do have to weigh feedback across multiple firms and feedback coming from both workers and managers. So I don't take a deterministic view here. These technologies might be an occasion for expanded worker voice, or the status quo might be maintained where frontline workers have more limited input. So to investigate these issues, I conducted a 20-month ethnography that I said is still ongoing of a machine tool shop I call Metalworks. And Metalworks is a high road employer. They provide competitive wages, a profit sharing program, but like most shops of its size, it's non-unionized and does not use formal employee involvement practices when implementing new technologies. Metalworks began conversations with this smart manufacturing tech company that I call ProdTech in 2018. And as you can see in the image, ProdTech connects these tablets to CNC machines to monitor their production. And the tablets display bright colors depending on the machine's current progress towards a predefined production goal. So like this bright green you can see here. Over the course of my data collection, I tracked occasions where an issue regarding ProdTech was raised, either by workers or by managers, though the worker-initiated cases are going to be the focus of this paper in this presentation. And so what I found is that while not much changed at Metalworks over the course of the study, there were these two distinct time periods during which workers' issues were raised differently and addressed differently. And what divided these time periods were changes that were made at the ProdTech vendor in the way the technology was designed and developed. So because ProdTech was a young company, especially when I started data collection, it was really a startup. So during the first 18 months of its use at Metalworks, there was no formal product development team or process at ProdTech. So the vendor customer support and software engineers managed customer issues, and they were really just addressed ad hoc. The customer support rep met with Metalworks managers about every 2 weeks to identify and address any issues. And this created only an indirect channel between workers and the vendor that was mediated by managers, since managers were the only ones that had direct access to ProdTech. During this time, workers raised some issues with how ProdTech was being used on the shop floor, but they did so under these existing norms for voice that they had. So machinist rights had always been informally negotiated at Metalworks. Machinists did tell me about how unusual the shop was compared to others in the industry, because the CEO frequently walked the shop floor and came to talk to machinists and continually referred to the shop's core values of teamwork and initiative. And machinists were expected to bring up issues that would benefit the organizational enterprise. So building on these existing norms, when machinists had issues around ProdTech, they framed the issues around the goal of ensuring that the data coming from ProdTech was legitimate and accurate for managers' use. So this meant that when machinists voiced issues around ProdTech, if it was collecting data inaccurately, for instance, these types of issues were addressed. But when machinists voiced dissatisfaction with the design of the bright tablet colors, which created this atmosphere of surveillance around the shop, these types of issues went unaddressed in this time period. But in response to an influx of funding at ProdTech hired a product development team that began following a formal product development process. And one of the key things that this team did was to conduct shop floor visits at Metalworks and at other firms, talking directly to machinists about their opinions of the technology. So this direct channel between machinists and the vendor was created. And this changed the way that machinists use voice. So during these shop floor visits, they began raising issues around the potential of expanding their own access to ProdTech's data, because the way it was configured was that only managers had access to the data. And machinists began engaging in brainstorming around potential new capabilities that ProdTech could have, rather than simply identifying problems around data collection. So these new voice practices resulted in more significant outcomes. More of the machinist issues were addressed, including their issue with the bright tablet colors and including expanding their access to data. So the ProdTech vendor undertook significant development efforts to redesign the tablets to accommodate these features, and the changes were distributed across the set of firms using the technology rather than just affecting Metalworks. So I call the model of worker voice in time one manager-mediated voice, and the model of worker voice in time 2 that was created through this direct channel, vendor-enabled voice. And I'll just wrap up on this next slide here. What I found is that manager-mediated voice looks similar to the expectations of prior literature. It operated through authority that was granted to workers through negotiated agreements with managers. It was leveraged during the implementation phase, as well as these ongoing incremental improvements to work routines. And it was oriented towards customizing technology and work routines to each other in the specific workplace, that Metalworks in this case. In time 2, I identified a second model with different characteristics. So this vendor-enabled voice operated through a direct channel between workers and vendors that elevated worker feedback to be on par with that of management. It was deployed during ongoing technology use, and it was leveraged to brainstorm new capabilities that could be applied across firms. And worker voice was more successful in this model, and workers ended up achieving better conditions surrounding the use of prod tech through these technology improvements that softened surveillance and increased workers' access to data. And finally, I identified that the change from time 1 to time 2 occurred not through changes in practices at Metalworks, but in changes to the work roles and routines at the vendor. So most importantly, that the vendor visited the shop floor to speak directly to workers. And this created new opportunities for workers to share more in-depth opinions and ideas around the technology. Happy to go into any specific examples if we have time, but I'll just leave you with what I hope is the impression that these vendors and their development process matters in shifting the power relations around workers and managers. And this is going to be increasingly important as these types of technologies diffuse throughout manufacturing and throughout other sectors. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Oh, Jenna, you stuck right to the time you promised. And
Right.
I know I made a list of questions. I'm sure that other people have plenty of questions as well. So it'll be, and comments. So really interesting. So glad that you shared that. I'm going to move right along so that we have lots of time for questions and answers and discussion. And that brings me to you, James. So I will mute myself and invite you to share your work.
Okay, thank you very much, Debra. Let me see if I can get my screen up here. There we go. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. James Parrott is my name. I'm the Director of Fiscal and Economic Policies at the Center for New York City Affairs at New School. I'm going to be talking this afternoon about the road to and from salary parity in early childhood education in New York City. And the parity here we're talking about is parity between educators in the nonprofit community-based organization sector and public schools. Early childhood education, as we all know, is an area gaining increased prominence for its value for child development, and yet it's one characterized by vastly inadequate public investment and pay disparities. And often these pay disparities are characterized by significant gender and racial dimensions. These disparities are often also mainly a function of the fact that early childhood education mostly takes place in non-public school settings in the United States, with much of that in large cities taking place in nonprofit organizations. Nationally, 5 out of every 6 early childhood educators are not in public schools. Labor unions can make a difference in this environment in securing added resources and building public support to begin to address salary disparities. Last July, the City of New York signed a collective bargaining agreement with AFSCME District Council 37 to phase in starting pay salary parity for about 4,200 nonprofit early childhood educators and support staff. A similar agreement was reached a few months later, covering 2,600 staff in nonprofit-based Head Start programs. Under these agreements, pay will rise by about $20,000 annually, or 30 to 50%, for state-certified early childhood educators of 2, 3, and 4-year-olds, to put them on a par with starting pay for unionized public school teachers. This is apparently the first large-scale national example achieving a semblance of salary parity between public schools and nonprofit-based early childhood education programs. Note that I'm referring here to starting pay salary parity and a semblance of salary parity, because we're not quite there yet in terms of achieving a comprehensive approach to salary parity between these two sectors. This paper was mainly written for a local audience to better understand the road to salary parity, that is, to understand the factors that developed over a period of years that gave rise to this historic 2018 achievement, and to understand the road from salary parity, that is, to underscore the fact that much remains to be done to achieve full compensation parity and greater early childhood investments. But I do believe this story has relevance beyond New York City. I'll try and touch on the main points in this history. In many respects, the key developments was the commitment of the Bill de Blasio administration. He was elected in 2013 for a term to start in January of 2014. He campaigned mainly on a pledge to establish universal pre-kindergarten in New York City for 4-year-olds. It was a signature issue of his campaign, and he pledged to do it in his first year in office. Up until that point, only about a third of 4-year-olds were in pre-K classrooms, some in public schools, but most in nonprofit community-based organizations. While de Blasio had sought to fund the expansion through a progressive income tax, our governor, Cuomo, current governor also, rejected that idea and instead opted to have it funded out of existing state revenues that were growing at the time. To expand UPK rapidly in New York City, the city opted to continue its reliance on community-based organizations. A large expansion took place in the first year. It was completed in the second year, with enrollment going to about 70,000 4-year-olds in New York City, with close to 60% of those seats in community-based organizations. So once UPK was established, the salary parity issue naturally started to get a lot of attention. UPK teachers in the public schools in New York City are part of a United Federation of Teachers contract, a very strong contract, been around for many years. So the public school teachers were benefiting from the strong pay and benefit provisions in that contract. Many CBO teachers, once UPK was expanded, left for the public schools, and recruitment and retention problems grew that would plague this CBO sector for years and are a continuing problem to this day. The city provided an immediate modest pay bump up, but it fell short of parity, and it wasn't increased very much over the next few years, even as public teacher starting salaries started to rise. There's a separate issue that I won't spend much time on today about how collective bargaining, the contrast in the way collective bargaining was handled under de Blasio compared to his predecessor, Mike Bloomberg, who left office in 2013 with none of the contracts covering over 300,000 public sector workers currently in effect at the time. Now, the irony here is that the teachers and the staff at many of the CBO early childhood programs and childcare centers in the city had been unionized since the 1960s, but they were organized under District Council 1707, a different district council than 37, which 37 represents most municipal workers in New York City. The service workers and clerical workers, New York City has many unions across the board, including the teachers union. And 1707 had jurisdiction in the private sector, including the nonprofit social services sector. 1707 was not able to negotiate a contract under Mike Bloomberg. So they had gone basically for 10 years up until 2014 without a contract in effect. Consequently, the pay and benefits eroded significantly over this time. Bloomberg also underfunded in his last few years in office in the wake of the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, the whole sector of human services in New York City. So once UPK was established, the union 1707 and the sector campaigned vigorously for several years to draw attention to the public to the pronounced pay disparity. Now, things changed in 2019. It was a confluence of a number of events, and I'll try and wrap up in a couple of minutes here. One was the campaign was the nonprofit sector campaign was stepped up, and it coincided with the city moving jurisdiction or administrative control over the early childhood education sector to the city's Department of Education from its Children's Services Agency. This put much more focus on the salary pay disparity. City Council also was mobilized by the sector to become more involved in the budget process in terms of funding for salary parity. And importantly, in June of 2019, District Council 1707 was absorbed into the much larger DC 37, and DC 37 then was given jurisdiction to represent and organize workers in the nonprofit sector in New York City. Altogether, there are about 100,000 non-union social service workers in New York City working in CBOs that are primarily providing public services under city contracts. So DC 37 sees this as an organizing opportunity going forward. Once DC 37 got involved in negotiations, things moved very rapidly. The mayor was predisposed to bargain seriously with a powerful union like DC 37, and they reached an agreement that provided pretty significant pay increases. I have two charts here that show the gray line on top is the public school salary levels over the years, and the blue line at the bottom is what had been the DC 1707 pay level. And you can see the disparity in 2018 is pretty wide and then starts to narrow with the agreement that was reached in 2019, phasing in starting pay salary parity by 2021 at the level of public school teachers. And the other chart for teachers with a BA is very similar. So challenges remain, obviously, in terms of getting comprehensive salary parity, getting an enhanced career ladder in the sector, and expanding public funding for home-based childcare providers that serve a lot of infants and toddlers up to the age of 3 that are not covered in any way by the salary parity agreements. This issue will be an issue in the city election year in 2021. The current contract that was extended in 2019 expires in the fall of 2022 at the same time as the UFT contract. So DC 37's expectation is that they will be able to then move closer to the UFT model, not only in terms of a broader notion of pay disparity, but also longevity, pay factors that they don't now have in their contract, and better benefits. But why don't I stop at that point? Thank you.
Thank you, James. That was a lot to take in, and I had no idea. I learned a lot there that I'm sure I'm not alone in the room with that, because there's some surprising numbers and some very interesting progressions there. So I can see Lisa put up a question on the chat. If you have a question for Jenna or for James, you could put it up on our chat as give our speakers a chance to kind of think about that. before we move to Q&A, we are going to hear from Brandon next, and then we will move to a question and answer for the whole group. So if you think of a question, you can put it up on chat, and then we can talk about it together. So Brandon, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm really excited to be a part of such a cool group. I'm enjoying hearing what everyone is working on. Can you hear me okay? I'm sorry.
Yep.
Perfect.
Yep,
Okay.
perfect.
Excellent. Okay, so I think, are my slides on the screen now?
You are loud and proud on the screen. We are good.
Wonderful.
That's what we like. I like the Rams up there, the little shout out to your Farmingdale Rams. So we got it.
Wonderful. Got it. I actually had to use this slide template myself because they just switched to a new web page this year, and they haven't like moved over a lot of stuff to the new web page, so there's no access to like the stock of like slide decks and things. So I made this all on my own. So
oh wow, it is unauthorized.
that's unauthorized, and that's the limitation of my creativity, I think, right there. So enjoy. I'm really glad to be in a group where we're talking about, you know, worker voice, and you know, I am approaching this notion of worker voice from a bit more of like a traditional versus contemporary perspective, I guess. And so I'm kind of raising these questions about what happens when unions engage in these certain types of behaviors that are inconsistent with the way that they traditionally represent their workers. And so I'm working on a set of papers so 3 of them are for my dissertation, and then 2 more are additional papers that sort of provide some boundary conditions for everything I'm doing. But essentially what I'm looking at is labor union shareholder activism. So I'm looking at what happens when labor unions, through their pension funds, purchase large shares of stock in various publicly traded firms and then use their leverage as shareholders to influence corporate governance. So it's kind of long been held that as shareholders, unions sort of behave like kind of like irrational actors, or if nothing else, maybe they pursue particularistic interests that sort of separate themselves from other investing groups. And so I'm kind of looking at this and asking questions about, well, are these really competing things? And is that really what's happening? And so I'm just kind of trying to figure out how and under what circumstances unions actually engage in shareholder activism. Are they any good at it? Sort of what's their motivation? So I'm asking a lot of these questions. And one of the papers I'm working on right now is called The Dual Agency Problem of Labor Unions. And so I'm sort of asking this question about, does the worker, or does a union's role as the agent in the workplace, does that conflict with their fiscal agency responsibility on behalf of workers through their pension funds? So I can talk more about that later if anyone has questions, but it's a really interesting phenomenon when you really think about it. It's actually a lot more common than people realize. For like the Airline Pilots Association, they filed something in the neighborhood of 10 shareholder resolutions against Delta Airlines over a 7-year period. And that's literally the only firm that they've ever targeted for shareholder activism in the entire 15-year window of my data. So it's not an accident that they just happen to be targeting the firm that they also have workers represented at. And they're also not submitting shareholder resolutions against like Comcast, for instance. So there's something going on there, and that I'm trying to figure out what. So in this paper, this is the 3rd essay from my dissertation. I finished, I was supposed to graduate just a month ago, but due to the pandemic, I wasn't able to walk, but that's okay. But so in essence, what I'm asking is, who are the firms that unions target for shareholder activism? And so quite simply, what I'm doing is I'm looking at D.C. roles and saying, you know, as bargaining agents, unions do actually target firms who are engaging in like downsizing, for instance. And so the likelihood and the frequency of being targeted for shareholder activism goes up. And so my data sort of show that, and I'll I'll be quick here. So I just want to tell you the big picture story. That as bargaining agents using their position as shareholder activism, unions do, in fact, they are more likely to target firms that lay off workers. They're also more likely to target firms who are hemorrhaging funds, that are losing money. So as their earnings before interest and taxes are going down from one year to the next, they're more likely to be targeted for shareholder activism by these unions. Additionally, unions also do still engage as normal shareholders. And so simultaneously, the likelihood, just like bigger firms, just like any other shareholder, bigger firms are more likely to be targeted by unions for shareholder activism. And so firms in terms of size, in terms of employee count, are more likely to be targeted, and bigger financially successful firms are just more likely. And so I can kind of show you what that looks like. Here's a little narrative. I didn't know if I would have enough time, and so I'll be quick about this. But in essence, what I was saying, one of the papers I'm working on, I'm telling an anecdotal story here that basically says, here's a whole bunch of instances where unions are targeting firms. Sometimes they're firms that they already represent workers at. Other times it happens to be firms, so like the Teamsters is an example. The Teamsters, at the same time as they were holding union representation elections through the NLRB, in the same years that they were holding representation elections for garbage truck drivers at Allied Waste and Republic Waste, they were also targeting them with shareholder resolutions, frequently, like several times each of those years. I don't think that's an accident. And interestingly enough, sometimes the Teamsters actually withdrew those resolutions, which means they voluntarily chose not to pursue that resolution, which governance people typically assume that that's an indication that the firm gave the shareholder something. But it can be assumed that maybe they agreed to some sort of a neutrality agreement during organizing campaigns or something like that, perhaps. Other instances of like UA, which is the plumber and pipe fitters union, and the sheet metal workers both have submitted resolutions against Boeing consistently. Like I said, airline pilots and Delta, Communication Workers of America have been targeting AT&T and Comcast for years. And so these are just all examples of, probably not coincidence, that these happen to be the firms that are being targeted for shareholder activism. So, so these are my hypotheses. In essence, I'm just hypothesizing exactly what you might think, that bigger firms are more likely to be targets, more financially stable companies are more likely to be targets. But then in terms of, as I was saying, like in terms of bargaining agency, firms that are losing money, that are losing profits, are more likely to be targeted, and firms that are downsizing are more likely to be targets as well. And so these are just my data codes. And so then here's the fun stuff. So these, my first set of models are just standard logistic regression models. So a 0 just simply means you weren't targeted, a 1 means you were, and these are S&P 1500 firms by year. And so you can see it's a big set of observations, over 45,000. And again, that's because that's 1500 firms by year. And so as you can see, so the final models here, model 4 is the full model with everything included. As the employee count, so that's a log variable, as the employee count goes up, the likelihood or the probability of being targeted goes up by a factor of 0.38. And same goes for earnings before interest, downsizing, and loss of earnings from one to the next. And so all of these things at the same time, all consistently predict the likelihood of being targeted going up. And then the second set of models, again, so over 46,000 observations and a whole lot of zeros. And so when you have zero inflated data, I use negative binomial regression for these models. And so just simply for, as employee count goes up, the likelihood of being targeted by an additional shareholder resolution goes up by all these same factors, very, very similar to the probability in the first data set, or the first set of models. And so in essence, the kind of what I'm trying to do here is, as I mentioned at the beginning, and so just to summarize, I'm trying to unpack what on earth is going on here. Are unions good shareholders? Are they successful as activists? Do they accomplish what they're trying to accomplish? And what are they actually trying to accomplish? And so that's more or less it. So I want to go ahead and be mindful of time, so I'm going to stop there. And thank you.
All right. Thank you, Brandon. You know, that is so interesting. We're seeing these kind of different angles of employee voice, and you're bringing that out in your work. And I know, you know, over the years, over recent years, we've seen some examples of nuns joining, buying stock and then attending shareholder meetings and then very vociferously pursuing a particular stakeholder perspective. So it shouldn't be surprising what we see here. So if you have a question about or a comment about Brandon's work and in this topic or any of the things that he said he could talk more about, you can leave a question in the chat. We have two already. So the first one is for Jenna. And Lisa, did you want to speak to your question before Jenna answers it so that everybody can hear it? I don't know if everybody's super comfortable with the chat function. Hopefully by now we're all Zoom experts, but.
Sure. I'm happy to say something.
Great.
Great paper. I really enjoyed your paper, Jenna. I'm curious, what actually drove the vendor to, I mean, you mentioned it was a new vendor, so they're learning, obviously, what they're doing in the process of building a product. But I'm wondering if you had any conversations with them about what drove that decision, and then how that played out with the employer and the managers, and was there any challenges or issues that arose?
Yeah, so not least due to COVID, I'm actually embedded with the vendor now much more than the manufacturing firm, because I can attend the vendor's meetings virtually. And so I'm exploring exactly these types of questions and following the design and development process through, because they still are in the process of releasing some new enhancements to the machinist tablet interface. And really, I mean, I think it was initially a simple matter of expansion and formalization. They did not have very many employees at the beginning, of course, because they were a startup. And I think recognized that there were some design issues with their product. Apparently, you know, technical things on the back end just weren't working well when they wanted to expand and scale. And so they knew they needed to have a more formal kind of software development process around this. So they brought in people who had experience in the tech industry, not so much in manufacturing. And I think it's just a very common practice in the tech industry to use this user-centered design concept. So this team kind of thought nothing of the idea of going to talk to their users. And it's interesting that their users in this case are both managers, they're engineers, they're machinists, and they wanted to get as wide a perspective as possible. And I think the first couple shop floor visits that they did were really eye-opening for them. I was on, you know, observing the first one that they did at my tool shop, and I heard the vendor say, you know, this wasn't designed with the emotional component at all. Like, they just got a really clear sense that machinists were really feeling negatively about the technology. And they, you know, as the now designers and developers of this product, they don't want their users to hate it. They take that personally. That's something they're, you know, putting their entire working life into developing, and they want it to be a success. But I think they have since realized the kind of sensitivities and the kind of very traditional hierarchies that exist in these organizations. So I know there are some of their customer firms that don't allow them to go walk the shop floor. For some, it's security concerns. For some, the vendor thinks that it's just because there's a negative culture, and they don't really want to expose the vendor to any negative opinions that the workers might have. So what they've tried to do is just get a set of their customers that are much more progressive and open to this type of interaction directly with the workers. And that's how they're handling it now. You know, these updates that they're working on to the operator tablet, I've actually been surprised to see how few firms they're talking to who actually do let them talk to the workers. For the most part, they're running these prototypes past managers who can be very dismissive of, you know, oh yeah, that'll be easy. Oh yeah, they'll figure this out. Oh, they don't need that. Like they're trying to speak for their workers, which there's obviously a lot more going on when you talk to people who are directly doing the work, as I saw with my firm. So, it's something that I'm continuing to follow through, and I'm thinking about how the vendor's going to balance this different feedback. Do they take suggestions from a manager who's clearly kind of has an antagonistic relationship with his workers? Do they take that suggestion differently? Do they not? Those are questions that I'm still looking at right now.
Yeah, that is, I think what's so fascinating about that is that it's almost like management's lawyers didn't get the message for a while. And there was this idea, like you said, that the vendors are going to want to talk to the users. And then finally, somebody thought, maybe this isn't in our best interest for this to happen, but it really is. So, then they have to make some trade-offs, I think. So I think that there's your follow-up. There's a follow-up we request, the crowd requests, Jenna, is, what, why do some companies take a more kind of user feedback approach, allowing that voice? It's in their best interest, in management's best interest, but nobody wants to hear any complaining. So it's a dichotomy. Yeah. So I'm sure that there are differences among firms on that. Yeah, I'm glad you raised that question, Lisa. I was wondering that too, because I thought, what lawyer would allow this? But now I know.
I think it helps that my firm's very small and informal too. So I'm sure the larger ones are very much new. You cannot go onto the shop floor.
Right. Like you said, with the CEO
floor.
walking through. Yeah, right. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I have a couple, I actually have one thought that links all of these, but I want to, I want to make sure Michael has time to talk about a couple of interesting questions he raised in the chat. So I'll withhold until the end. But Michael, would you mind just kind of saying a couple of words about your thoughts there before you turn it over to James?
Sure. Well, I'm always a big fan of James's work documenting progress that workers are having in New York, and he's got a lot of that in his background. So James, first question I just had was, which seems like I think an obvious follow-up to the story that you presented today, is that there has been no move in Congress to, as of yet, to create a large state and local aid package, although Democrats have put forward, but Republicans are just holding their feet on it. So, if there was to be either a limited or no such bailout package, I mean, how does that affect the whole context we're talking about there, and also for other workers that are employed by the city of New York?
Thank you for that question, Michael. Good to see you there. Glad you turned your video on. Good to see your face. I actually think, given where the economy is right now and where it's headed, and the fact that we have an election a few months down the road, that Republicans will come to their senses and decide that a significant dose of additional economic stimulus is needed. And hopefully there are enough governors across the country who will prevail in making the argument that they really need assistance for that. And of course, some of that will trickle down in New York State to New York City, if there's not sort of direct federal aid for local governments in that. So I think by early September, I think the situation will change on that front. Then there's the added factor, and I know it's evident in New York City, and I can only imagine that it's probably the case in other cities as well. There's increased attention to what can be done locally to address racial inequities. And partly that's related to, this amazing development we've seen emerge recently of pressure to redeploy police department budgets to human services areas. So that's getting a lot of attention in New York City. There's serious support within the city council. The city of New York's fiscal year begins July 1st. So this is in the height of budget negotiation talks. the speaker is putting together a proposal to cut the city's NYPD's budget by the 1 billion out of 6 billion currently in the next fiscal year and redeploy that. In addition, there's pressure for the city to expand investments to address pay disparities, and the pay disparity that's true, that that which remains in the early childhood sector is very heavily race-based. The broader pay disparity, which I touched on in the long version of the paper, is very widespread in the human services contracting sector, which affects 60 to 100,000 workers in New York City. Again, very heavily gender-based, race-based as well. We have a new report that documents some of those race disparities. And while, just a month ago, I thought that there wasn't a chance to move on addressing the broader pay disparities within the human services sector. In the last 2 weeks, people have been reaching out saying, what can the city do now to address racial inequities? So here's a proposal that we've been working on to establish a career ladder sector that would be city funded for the human services contracts, and would help address some pretty glaring pay disparities that we documented in this report that we're working on. So it's a very fluid environment. So maybe I'm just focusing on the positive glimmers in that, but to me, it looks like, at least in New York City, that we could see some progress, continued progress on that front in the next few months.
Well, thanks for adding some notes of optimism there. I've been feeling more pessimistic and wondering in particular, even if the Senate does come to its senses. It's obviously in the political interests of Republicans up and down the ticket to have a better economy in the fall, which the state and local aid will help manifest. So it'd be rational for them to do it. I've been a little bit more pessimistic than I think you are, but yeah, let's hope. And then the other piece that I wanted to ask was just, I've been very struck by your work on the Uber workers last couple of years, and then this work here, that it's really splendid to see under a fairly progressive mayor and a really strong labor movement within New York City to see these kinds of really positive developments. And the question is it just a New York City phenomenon? What is your sense of the ability to diffuse this model to other parts of the country where you have governors, and probably mayors are probably much stronger, governors less so. But yeah, just what do you see the potential for diffusing this beyond New York City?
Part of what needs to happen is for there to be greater public support for early childhood education generally. And when we had a Democratic primary a few months ago, it was interesting that a lot of the leading candidates, prioritized increased public investment in early childhood education. So hopefully that interest will go someplace in the next several months. That will help set the stage for discussions over making sure that these increased investments are done in a way to ensure high quality. And the focus on quality, I think, will bring with it interest in raising the pay and benefits of the teachers in that sector. So I do think that's one area that should receive a lot of attention in the next year, of course, depending on what the outcome of the election is.
Well, one thing I noticed about all three, and James, thank you for on the fly trying to think about how that might apply in other places. And I agree with Michael, your optimism is so needed and so appreciated, and it's not pie in the sky crazy optimism. It's linked to real events that are going on and real research that you've contributed to. I noticed for all three, though, that the thought that keeps coming back to me, and I don't know if anybody else, if you want to roll this marble around, yourselves, or comment on it, but if you start, for example, with Brandon's research and work backwards, the channel for the message, the voice, the channel seems to be shaping the message. And then, so in Brandon's kind of point, the or study, the channel of being at a shareholder meeting, or raising it in that channel, kind of calls for a different message. The political channel and the whole like push and pull and that James is describing seems to be shaping the message. And Jenna's channel's brand new, right? So we have this vendor who kind of says, well, we always talk to users. We always want to make our products relevant and user friendly, and really this is a new channel kind of in a lot of ways. So what I'm wondering is, before we always talked about the message and how do we get the channel, how do we, either through union or non-union environments, whether it's through formal or informal procedures, how do we get this employee voice out? Now I feel like it's flipped in a way, and I wondered if you guys could speak to that, whether the channel is shaping the message, and also maybe shaping the dispersion of the voice. To Lisa's point with Jenna in the chat, now that this voice is out through the channel and it's been shaped by the channel, is it catching? Is it something that the channel is leaky? Whereas before we had very clear union representation and agreements. Maybe we had multi-bargaining, but so I'm going to just throw that out there as a closing thought. We have just a few minutes left, and maybe get some of our panelists' perspectives on that.
I'll just share a really quick thought on that, which is that I think, if anything, we're just going to need more channels now, because each of these channels seems to be limited as to the issues that can be addressed. I mean, I know mine the best, and it's been really striking to me that this technology, while it's important in the workplace, there's so many other issues at the workplace that certainly can't be addressed by a technology vendor, right? There are other channels that are needed for what are likely more important issues for workers. So there's some dispersion of issues as well.
If I can weigh in, I would say that in my own line of research, when it comes to shareholder activism, more often than not, when any shareholders are submitting proxy proposals, they tend to target specific corporate governance related issues. And so it's actually quite rare for unions through their pension funds to submit shareholder resolutions that have something to do with like worker relations policy, for instance. More often than not, what they'll do is they'll submit a shareholder resolution to declassify the board of directors, for instance, because they know that that's something that'll get the attention of the board of directors, obviously, but it's something that will be supported by other shareholders. And so unions use that as it's a power move on their part. And so if what they're really looking for is neutrality agreements in certification elections, then they might target the CEO for declassification or target CEO pay, for instance, get the attention of the upper people, and then negotiate a backroom deal where they say, look, we'll drop the resolution if this is what we're assuming is happening. We'll drop the resolution. We won't come after you. We won't let everyone vote so you can see how many people really want your pay cut. And instead, if you just agree to neutrality agreements during these certification elections, then we'll all be happy.
Right. So there's
I agree.
Yeah,
I think
that's interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is. It's hostage negotiations. Very interesting. James, any thoughts? Oh, you're muted. We can't have that.
Got it. Thank you. I don't have anything further to add. I think I've talked enough. It's been a real pleasure to be on this panel. Great co-presenters. really interesting. I learned a lot. Thank you.
I feel the same
Same as
way.
well.
It was really, really a pleasure to share this time with you guys. If I could ask my speakers to, you can either email me or you could drop it in the chat. If you have slides that you're willing to share, I will make sure they're uploaded to our session slides and or the paper. I know people are really interested, and a lot of people are going to watch this on the recording, so they may not have gotten you live and in person, but I know they really, some of those slides you guys flew by, we were all trying to speed read them. So I'll send my email out in the chat. It's actually, it's debra.casey@temple.edu, TEMPLE. And if you send them to me, I'll make sure they are posted for our session. So thanks everybody for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your sessions. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Debbie.
Okay,
Thanks,
thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.